Today we're going to have a look at the 12th Mishnah of the second chapter of Pirkei Avos, Ethics of the Fathers, and it is in a certain regard a follow-on from the Mishnah that we just learnt, the previous Mishnah number 11, which is not unusual because very often you find that one Mishnah leads into the other. In fact, you could actually say that there's a series ever since Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai introduced us to his 5 major students a couple of Mishnahs ago. So it's probably fair to say that it's the same theme now that continues since then. So the Mishnah we're going to look at today is attributed to Rabbi Yossi. You might remember that when Rabbi Yossi was introduced to us originally by his teacher, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, he was introduced with the title Chassid. Now remember that the Talmudic version, the Talmudic definition of a chassid means somebody who goes beyond what the law requires. Somebody who does more than is expected. Somebody who is not bound just simply by the strict letter of the law, but somebody who goes beyond the letter of the law. And that's quite significant because the theme of Pirkei Avos is things that take us beyond the letter of the law. So this is not the book of strict Judaism. This is the book of going beyond the expectations of Judaism. Now what we're going to see in this Mishnah is that Rabbi Yossi teaches us 3 principles. And as soon as that happens, and this should be a theme for us, anytime that we learn Pirkei Avos, we should immediately ask ourselves the question, what's the link? What's the theme between all 3 of these statements? The rabbis, the sages of the Mishnah, do not make statements just because it's going to have some kind of, poetic flow or some kind of, these are 3 principles which are important principles. These things are really carefully chosen. And so every time we have to ask ourselves the question, what's the theme over here? What's the theme that runs through, in this case, the 3 teachings of Rabbi Yossi? That's going to be a guiding principle of how we analyze this Mishnah. And then, of course, we're going to break them apart into their 3 components and analyze each of the 3 components individually. Now, at first brush, it doesn't seem like there's anything that links the beginning of the Mishnah to the end of the Mishnah, or any of the 3 statements together. In fact, they actually appear to be relatively disparate from each other, and so that's why it's quite interesting and valuable for us to do this analysis. So let's have a look at the Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi Omer. Rabbi Yossi taught 3 things. Number 1, Yehi momon chaverach chaviv alecha keshelach. The money of your friend should be cherished in your eyes as if it was your own money. Okay, now that's an interesting principle. Really it is, because according to the strict letter of the law, remember, Pirkei Avos is telling us how to go beyond the letter of the law. According to the strict letter of the law, my responsibility to your assets is to make sure that I don't take them and that I don't damage them. That's my responsibility. So, lo tignoiv, lo tigzoil, don't steal, lo sashoik, don't force people to pay your money, don't damage other people's property. We know that there's a lot of halacha around damage to property, whether it's intentional, whether it is inadvertent. So, as far as the strict letter of the law is concerned, as long as I'm careful not to cause you financial loss, I'm okay. Rabbi Yossi is telling us something beyond that. It's actually not good enough just to look out for the next person and to make sure that I don't reverse my car into yours and to make sure that I don't give you bad investment advice, that you lose a lot of money, and that I have to make sure that I don't hit my golf ball through your window. He says it's more than that. I've actually got to cherish your money. It's a fascinating thought when you think about it. It's fascinating because in Judaism, would you imagine that there's a notion of cherishing money in the first place? Doesn't matter whose it is. Wouldn't you expect that Judaism would be, and the Torah would teach us more about things like cherish the next person's soul, cherish their good deeds, cherish their character? Don't you think that that's the kind of thing we'd expect? And yet over here he says their money, the next person's money, should be chaviv, should be beloved to you as if it was your own money. It's a fascinating suggestion. We're going to have to examine it in greater detail. Number 2, he tells us, that you have to prepare yourself to learn Torah, not like everybody thinks. You just open the book, and that's it. Once you open the book, you're good. The information is right there. What further introductory work do you need to do? No, he says, haskein atzmach, you need to prepare yourself before you learn Torah. And then he explains why. She'eina Yerusha lach, because Torah is not an inheritance. It doesn't just fall into your lap. There's no download. There's no easy access. So if you want to be able to learn Torah, you're actually going to have to work on it. Now, I don't know if you immediately notice this, but to say such a statement actually seems to fly in the face of a very famous line in the Torah. What's he telling us? Prepare yourself in order to learn Torah, because it is not a Yerusha. It is not something that you inherit. What are you talking about? The Rambam writes that one of the first things you're supposed to teach a child, as soon as the child learns how to talk, is a pasuk from the last parasha in the Torah of V'zois HaBracha, which says, Torah tziva lanu Moshe. You know this line? You know this line, right? Everybody knows this line. Torah tziva lanu Moshe. The Torah was instructed to us by Moshe. Moirasha kehilas Yaakov. It is the inheritance of the community of Yaakov. There you have it, black on white. That's directly from the Torah. That Torah is our inheritance. It's not the property of some kind of elitist group of people. It's not reserved for yichus, that if you come from a particular lineage, then you have access to Torah. It's ours. It's ours, to everybody. Equal access. Moirasha, it's an inheritance. So why would Rabbi Yossi suggest over here that the Torah is Eino Yerushalach? It's not your inheritance. It's not your birthright. What do you mean? Of course it is. By virtue of the fact that I'm Jewish, regardless of how much I have or have not engaged with my Judaism, by virtue of the fact that I'm Jewish, it is my birthright. That's actually what Yerusha means. Because if you think about it halachically, from a simple legal perspective, just think about it this way. Any time that there is property or money for that matter, and it needs to get transferred from person 1 to person 2, there are effectively 3 ways in which it can be legally transferred. 1, you buy it. So that's kind of an exchange. You give money and you get the asset in return. In order to do that, obviously, there has to be money. You have to give something of value. And the second thing is there has to be an agreement between both parties. The Gemara talks about the status of somebody who forces the hand of a seller, and it's a bad thing to do. It's supposed to be willing buyer, willing seller. So in order to be willing buyer, willing seller, you both have to be of mature, sound mind, which means that only at a certain age can you make a kinyan, can you actually acquire something according to Jewish law. The other way in which you could acquire something is a person gives it to you as a gift. So now you, the recipient, do not necessarily have to buy and agree and be of sound mind, as long as the person who owns the asset has, of their own volition, chosen to give this to you. And even then the Gemara says, that if you hadn't done something that somehow ingratiated you to this person, he wouldn't have given you anything. So there's already some kind of a two-way relationship. But Yerusha, inheritance, the recipient doesn't have to do a thing. The recipient doesn't have to have intention. The recipient doesn't even have to have awareness. Because let's say, God forbid, that somebody passed away and there was a baby who was their heir, and the baby was a day old. So the baby doesn't have sound mind, the baby doesn't have intention, the baby doesn't have understanding, and yet the baby would inherit everything. So that's how Yerusha works. It's got nothing to do with your status, it's got nothing to do with your commitment, it's got nothing to do with your intention. And the Torah tells us, Moirasha kehilas Yaakov, that the Torah is ours, and by way of inheritance, which means regardless of who we are, what we have or haven't done. Why does Rabbi Yossi over here say, Eina Yerushalach, it's not your inheritance? What does he mean by that? And then the third point is, V'chol ma'asecha, all of your actions, yiyu l'shem shamayim, should all be directed to the sake or for the sake of heaven. It's also an interesting concept, right? That everything that you do should be directed for the sake of heaven. Now immediately you have to ask yourself the question, well, what's the connection? What is the connection between these 3 statements? Look after somebody else's money and care for it as if it were your own. Prepare yourself to learn Torah, and everything that you do should be directed towards Hashem. Okay, so we need to understand what's going on over here. Various commentaries offer various suggestions. We're going to have a look at 2 of them first, and then we're going to unpack all 3 statements and come back to see if we can derive another common theme that runs through all of them. Okay? So the first explanation that is given is that there are basically 3 major areas in which a person has to work on themselves. If you want to be a good Jew, basically 3 areas that you have to focus on. Okay? I think we're all happily consider ourselves good Jews, please God. So there are three areas that a person has to master in order to actually be considered, so to speak, a good Jew. What are the three areas? The one area is how you deal with other people. So the connection that you have with other people, we know that Rabbi Akiva famously said, "Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamoicha," love your fellow Jew. Ze klal gadol b'Torah. This is the underpinning of the whole of Judaism. So, if you want to be a good Jew, you have to have a good connection with your fellow Jew. The second thing that we need to do is we have to make sure that we have a good connection to Hashem. Right? That's obviously very important. We have to have a good connection to Hashem. And the third thing that we have to do is we have to have a good connection to ourselves. We have to be healthy within. Because unfortunately, as we've already seen previously in some of the other Mishnahs, some people get so carried away with helping everybody else that they kind of ignore themselves. So it's important to look after yourself, to look after your relationship with Hashem, and to look after your relationship with the next person. So, it's to address those three things that Rabbi Yossi put these three suggestions. He says, let's talk firstly about how you deal with the next person. How do you deal with the next person? You have to have a good relationship with them. So how do you deal with the next person? Well, what you need to do is you need to care about their things. It's an interesting psychology. Because the moment you are conscious to care about somebody else's things, you will certainly know that you have to care about them as people. So that's the first lesson that he gives. Care about people's things, and by extension you will come to care about them as people, and that's one of the cardinal principles of what it is to be Jewish. Number two, you have to look after yourself. You have to look after yourself. Prepare yourself to learn Torah. There's no better way to look after yourself than to learn Torah, don't you think? I mean, ultimately, the whole purpose of Torah is that we elevate ourselves, we connect ourselves to Hashem. That's actually what Torah is all about. So fantastic, that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to focus on learning Torah. And how do you connect yourself to Hashem? Well, the way to connect yourself to Hashem is through the principle of Kol Masechel Hashem Shamayim, that every single thing that you do should be directed towards Hashem. Okay, so that's a simple explanation of how you could say all three of these things are directly related to the three major principles that a Jewish person always has to focus on. There's another angle as well, a different angle that we can take, and that is that this Mishnah is a direct follow-on from the previous Mishnah that we learned. What was the previous Mishnah? Rabbi Yoshua told us that there are three things that could destroy a person. What are the three things that could destroy a person? In his words, Moitzian esa adam min ha'olam, they drive you out of this world. What are the three things? So he said, ayin hara, a bad eye, yetzer hara, a bad inclination, which unfortunately is part and parcel, it's built into the human experience. The sinas habrios, and hatred towards other people. Those are the three things that, God forbid, could drive a person out of the world. So what does he say is the antidote to those things? Rabbi Yossi says, I'll tell you what the antidote is. After Rabbi Yoshua in the previous Mishnah told me what the three greatest threats are to any good, decent human being, let me tell you the antidotes. So ayin hara, to have a negative, to have a bad eye, one of the translations, we looked at this last week, one of the translations of having a bad eye is that you're stingy. You don't see other people's assets as a good thing. On the contrary, it's a person who lands up being quite jealous. Oh, how come that person has what they need? How come things always work for them? So the antidote to that attitude, where we get upset over somebody else's success, which is a very unhealthy place to be, but it's unfortunately more common than what people are willing to admit. So what's the antidote to that? Love somebody else's money as if it were your own. In other words, you should celebrate their success. It's quite a big shift, by the way. It's one of the great psychological challenges of the modern world, because we are typically envious of other people, of their money, of their assets, of the house that they live in, the car that they drive, whatever it is. It's very much part and parcel of the society that we live in today. So perhaps you could say we're a society where people are being driven around the twist and being driven out of their minds. Maybe actually it's exactly what Rabbi Yoshua said in the previous chapter. But the ability to celebrate somebody else's success, the ability to literally have nachas, to feel the beauty, the chavivus, the beloved element of somebody else's assets, that is potentially the way in which a person could solve or at least neutralize the natural response that we have, which is to kind of be a little bit jealous of other people's success. What about Yetzer Hara? Yetzer Hara, unfortunately, however wildly you want to translate the word Yetzer Hara, evil inclination. I always chuckle a little bit when we use this word evil inclination, because what does it actually mean? Everybody thinks, the minute you say evil inclination, say, I don't really have one of those. I'm not an evil person. I don't have a bad bone in my body, I'm really decent and I try my best. So let's get away from that and say Yetzer Hara means the inclination to things that are not good. The inclination to speak as we shouldn't speak. The inclination to look where we shouldn't look. To engage in things we shouldn't engage in. The inclination to be lazy when there are things that we should be doing. That's the Yetzer Hara. Unfortunately, it's built into the human system. Comes with every package. Nobody's immune. Now, you can be assured that you're going to tackle a Yetzer Hara throughout your life. And no two people will have identical Yetzer Haras. And that's why we often look at people and say, I don't understand what's with this person. And how come it is that they can't get over this particular little thing that is apparently so difficult for them? For me, it's not a big deal. Yeah, because my Yetzer Hara is different to theirs. So how do you fix this? How do you tackle a Yetzer Hara? What do you do? So the Gemara says, Im poga b'cha menuval zeh, if this no goodnik, menuval is a little bit more dramatic than that. Menuval is like saying this low life. If this low life crosses your path, the low life over here referring to the Yetzer Hara, mashcheu leveis hamedrash, drag it to the yeshiva. In other words, the antidote, as the Gemara says elsewhere, Hashem makes a statement, barasi Yetzer Hara, I created the Yetzer Hara, barasi loy Torah tavlin, and I created the Torah as the antidote to the Yetzer Hara. So a person wants to neutralize the Yetzer Hara, fill your mind with Torah. It might sound like it's a far-fetched solution. It's not at all, actually. I recently heard a story somebody told where this fellow says that he was in yeshiva, and he was a little bit of a chutzpahdik yeshiva bocha. And in his chutzpah, it was getting close to Yom Kippur, he went to his Rosh Yeshiva, and he said to his Rosh Yeshiva, have you done teshuvah yet? Can you imagine? So the Rosh Yeshiva looked at him and said, I don't get the time to do Averis. In other words, if you're so engaged and immersed in learning in every free moment, it's fascinating. I was talking amongst a group of friends yesterday. We had a Zoom, as is customary at the moment, and we were talking. And one of the things that one of the people said was, if you look at the learning schedule that is expected of us, it's like, where do you have the time? Where do you have the time to be able to learn the parasha every week? And we're supposed to learn a piece of the Tanya every single day. And then there's Gemara that you're supposed to learn. And there's Rambam that you're supposed to learn. It's like a whole schedule that everybody's... Where do you find the time? You know what's fascinating? Somehow we always find the time to read that nonsensical WhatsApp message that somebody sends, or to watch that cute little clip that somebody forwarded that actually is absolutely meaningless, especially seeing it's commenting on American politics and we don't live in America, so what's the difference to us? Somehow we find time for all of those things. So what's the antidote to the Yetzer Hara? To be so occupied with studying Torah that we don't have the opportunity for the Yetzer Hara to get a grip on us. That's what Rabbi Yossi says over here. Haskein atzmecha lilmoid Torah. You have to prepare yourself to learn Torah. What do you think? Learning Torah is just because there happens to be a shir on the calendar, so this is my time that I learn Torah? No, we have to prepare ourselves. To prepare yourself means that we make a plan and we ensure that the time that we're supposed to be learning Torah is sacrosanct. There's nothing to discuss, no distractions, no devices. I always think how long before there were smartphones, there's a saying from the Rebbe that when you learn Torah, you should treat the telephone as if it were Shabbos. Can you imagine in those days we had the corded phone, the long cord, and it was in another room, and he said, treat it as if it's Shabbos. Could you imagine today? Today it's near impossible for a person to sit through an entire period of Torah learning, whether it's your own learning or whether it's on a shir or whatever. It's near impossible to do so without being distracted by the phone. So what's the antidote to the Yetzer Hara? Haskein atzmecha lilmod Torah. Don't just learn Torah, but prepare yourself to learn Torah. In other words, prepare to be absolutely focused. Prepare to learn Torah without distraction. And that way, the Yetzer Hara doesn't get airtime. Your mind is so preoccupied, you don't even hear the voice of the Yetzer Hara. Now, this is not about becoming a tzaddik. This is not becoming immune to the Yetzer Hara. This is just a practical way to ensure that we are so filled with what is healthy and good that there simply is no space for the rubbish. And then, what about sinas habrios? In the previous Mishnah, Rabbi Yoshua said that the final thing that could drive a person out of this world is when a person hates, God forbid, other people. And it happens. It happens. You know, like that old story that they tell, what's the difference between an anti-Semite and a Jew? Lahavdil. You know what the difference is? The difference is that when you speak to an anti-Semite, they say, all Jews are bad, all Jews are money hungry, all Jews control the world, the Jews are the cause of all of our problems. Then you say to the anti-Semite, how could you speak that way when your doctor, who you put your life into his hands, is Dr. Goldberg? So the anti-Semite says, Goldberg is an exception. So how does it work when you speak to a Jewish person? You speak to a Jewish person and say, Jews are the most amazing people in the world. We make up less than 1% of the world's population, but look how many hundreds of Nobel Prizes. Look at the contributions that we have made to science, to politics, to entertainment, to psychology. Jews are so innovative. Look at Israel, startup nation. Jews are geschmack. Jews have values. I say, how come you don't speak to Goldberg? Why do you have a faribel with Goldberg? Oh, he's an exception. So that's the difference, right? So sinas habrios, to be able to hate other people, unfortunately is real. It actually happens. It's a terrible thing, but it really happens. So how do you combat sinas habrios? How do you get around the urge that we often have to say, if that's how they treat me, what do you think? Now no, they're going to see now. I'm going to show them that you don't start up with me. So how do you get around it? Say, Avos Yisrael, right? That's what you'll say. Love of your fellow Jew. Not so simple. Not so simple to push myself when I have a loaded emotional attitude and I have a deep psychological block. It's not so simple to tell me, love your fellow Jew, get everybody around a bonfire, let's all sing together, yay, kumbaya, it's going to be amazing. So what does Rabbi Yossi say? He says, it's got to do with your orientation. If kol ma'asecha, if all of your actions in life are for your purpose, then the next person who doesn't suit that purpose or interferes with that purpose is going to be a thorn in your side. But if kol ma'asecha l'shem shamayim, if the whole reason that you live in the first place is to be able to serve Hashem and be able to do what Hashem wants, then you won't get all out of joint because somebody else didn't behave the way that they should have. It's not about me. It's not about what I need. It's not about what I care about. It's about what Hashem wants. Does Hashem want me now to be able to be good to this person? Yes, so that's what I'm going to do. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of how it is that the three themes of this Mishnah interlink. Now we're going to take these three themes into a little bit more detail, and from that we'll discover another theme that runs through the three. So, what's the first thing he says? Yehi mamen chavercha chaviv olecha keshelach. That what should happen is that you should be careful with somebody else's money, and you should not only be careful, but you should cherish their money as if it was your own money. Now, it's an interesting concept, and we really have to think about it. What is this concept? What are we trying to say over here? That you should really care about somebody else's money. What are we trying to say? Why should you care about money even if it's your own? Surely, if you were honest, surely the Torah doesn't want us to care about physical things. They come, they go, they're transient. How many stories have you heard over the years of great spiritual leaders of our people who did not care for this world? They didn't care for the physicality. Whether it was Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who as the leader of the Jewish people had to dress in a particular way so he'd be respected, and yet did not have proper soles on his shoes so he'd always be grounded. Or whether it was, who knows how many different stories we have of the person who lived in abject poverty. Now suddenly you're telling me chaviv. Reminds me a little bit of a story. There was once a wealthy man who supported a yeshiva. And he was very wealthy, but he was a person who believed that he was on the path of character development. And he came to one of the rebbes, I don't recall which. And he said, I just want to tell you that I'm working so hard on myself that I only eat bread and water. Eat bread, drink water. Like the Mishnah says, we're going to still learn, it's coming up in Pirkei Avos. Here I am, this wealthy person, I could afford anything. So this Rebbe told him, you're absolutely wrong. You have to eat meat every single day. Why? Because you support the bochrim in the yeshiva, who are young guys, who are growing boys, who need to be of sound mind in order to be able to study in yeshiva. Now, if your psychology is that you, the wealthy man, can get by on bread and water, what are you going to feed the bochrim in yeshiva? You'll definitely believe that they could get by on bread and water. So you have to be honest with yourself, and you have to eat sudas melech, sudas shlomo b'shaita. You got to eat like the feast of King Solomon. You got to eat well. That way, you will understand and appreciate that the bochrim also need to eat well, and you'll look after them properly. In other words, it's easy sometimes to use the card of Judaism is not into material things as an excuse not to look after the next person. When it comes to looking after the next person, chaviv, the next person's physical needs should be something which is beautiful to me. I care about it. The Gemara makes an interesting observation, because we all know that there's a strange story about our forefather Yaakov. Here Yaakov is on the eve of reuniting with his brother Esav, and he has no idea what to expect. Is Esav going to be aggressive? Is Esav going to be decent? He prepares for all eventualities, and he's moving his family into position for this great showdown that's going to happen the next day. What does the Torah tell us? Vayivoser Yaakov levadoi, and Yaakov is taking his family across this river called the Yaboik River, and he goes back and he lands up by himself, and that's where he wrestles the angel of Esav all through the night. So the Gemara wants to know, why did he go back? He had already moved his family to where they needed to be. He had moved his possessions. Why did he go back? Says the Gemara, he went back to collect pachim ketanim. Pachim ketanim basically means trinkets. Basically, I think Yaakov Avinu is the one who illustrated the first example of how Jewish people travel. Never seen how Jewish people travel? Any normal person, they arrive at the airport, if they're told they have 20 kilograms in one suitcase, they come with 20 kilograms in one suitcase. Jews come along, I've got the one suitcase, but then how many peklach do we have? The concept of hand luggage in the Jewish world, besides the fact that every suitcase is already overweight and we're trying to squeeze something in, you'll always see Jewish people at the airport like repacking suitcases. But in addition to that, we have all these peklach. Where do you get the peklach from? It's food. Who knows what happens? The kosher food on the plane might arrive frozen, and then we're not going to be able to eat. And what if there's a delay? And what if there's a stopover, and during the stopover we get delayed? You have to eat. And what if we're milchik and we need to eat fleshik? So there's a whole thing of all the peklach. What if it's going to be warm? What if it's going to be cold? What if the children need this? So you could argue maybe that goes back to Yaakov Avinu, right? That Yaakov Avinu, he was the original person apparently, on the face of it, who he went back for peklach, he went back for the little items that he had left behind. Asks the Gemara, why? Why was Yaakov so concerned? And listen to what the Gemara says, it's fascinating. It says, from here we learn that for tzaddikim, their material possessions are even more beloved than their physical body. It's a fascinating and shocking statement. We're talking about the most righteous, holy, pious individuals of our history, and the Gemara tells us that they find the little peklach to be more valuable than their own bodies. And then the Gemara explains why. Because they don't do anything which might get anywhere close to dishonesty in amassing their possessions. So therefore they care about their possessions. In other words, the Jewish attitude towards possessions is that possessions are an extension of my value system. They're not just things that I have. I don't just happen to have a whole lot of items, a whole lot of assets. For a Jewish person, every asset that I have is supposed to be an expression of my value system. You know why I own this? Because I worked in the realm of halacha, and I ran my business according to Jewish law, and I ran it with a sense of trust in Hashem, and that's why I closed the business on a Shabbos, and that's why I daven with a minyan in the morning and in the afternoon for mincha, and that's why I have a shiur every single day that I learn Torah, and that's why I would never do something which is even a borderline gray area illegal. So it's not just items. That's what Rabbi Yossi wants us to understand. When you look at the next person's things, don't just see things. See a beautiful fellow Jew who shares your values. See a fellow Jew who has the same focus, How do I use the opportunities that I have in the business environment or in the material environment to be a better human being, to be a better Jewish person, to be more connected to Hashem? In other words, the theme over here is not just looking at how could I care about your stuff, but using every entry point. That's what Rabbi Yossi is teaching us. Use every entry point to find a way to have greater respect and love for my fellow Jew. So even when I look at the items sitting on their mantelpiece, that should be for me a gateway to love that Jewish person. What's the second thing he tells us? That what you should do is you should work to learn Torah. Don't just learn Torah, work to learn Torah. And there are various commentaries. Some say work means to work on your character. Some say that work, haskein, comes from the word tikkun, which means to repair yourself, to fix flaws in your character, because then you can actually learn the Torah for real and not through the lens of your personal bias. Some say that haskein atzmecha means that you should remove pleasure-seeking from your life and instead focus on learning Torah. Why, he says? She'einu yerushalach. Because it is not an inheritance for you. What do you mean it's not an inheritance? We know, and we asked this question right at the beginning, we know that the Torah says, my Rasha, it is the inheritance, the birthright of every single Jewish person. Now you're giving me shock, horror, now you're telling me it's not an inheritance? How dare you say such a thing? So the truth be told, that there are different dimensions and realities of Torah. There's no question about it that Torah is equal access to every single person. It is our inheritance, and you may never close the door on a person who wants to learn Torah, regardless of what you think of them. Regardless of what you think they're going to do with the information. It's theirs as much as it is yours. Having said that, though, if you have a look in the Torah, it also, and we're going to learn this in Pirkei Avos later, we're going to learn that Torah is also called a kinyan, something that you have to acquire. Remember earlier I mentioned that there's different ways in which something could belong to you. So inheritance is one of the methods, and acquisition is another method. There's an element of Torah which you have to acquire. And in order to acquire that element of Torah, it's what we call yogaita umatzasa. This is a dimension of Torah which doesn't come naturally. Absolute basic entry-level Torah, equal playing field for everybody. Every Jew has access. But you want to get the depth. You want to get the real meat, the real power of Torah. That's not going to fall into your lap. Doesn't matter who your father is, your grandparents, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you come from a long, long line of rabbis and scholars. It doesn't matter. The depth of Torah can only be accessed by a tremendous amount of investment of energy. Now later on, when we get to the 6th chapter, the Mishnah is going to give us 48 methods that a person is supposed to use in order to access this depth of Torah. So when over here he talks about haskein atzmecha, fix or prepare yourself in order to learn Torah, later on the Mishnah will tell us what you're supposed to do. But you know what's interesting about it? You would think, look, if somebody wanted to know, how should I become a scholar? How should I become an academic? Most people will tell you, learn this, follow that course, read these books, participate in those courses. You know what's interesting about the Torah's approach? Have you ever walked into a yeshiva? Have you ever been in a yeshiva? I think the two most antithetical academic institutions in the world would be a university library and a yeshiva. University library, you walk in, it's mamish like absolute deathly silence. You know, the only sound you hear is the scratching of pens, I suppose in today's world, the typing on keyboards, and maybe the turning of pages. Lahavdil, you walk into yeshiva, you think you've walked into the shuk. It is so dynamic. People are literally leaning into each other's faces. There are piles of books. There's yelling and shouting and asking and debating and arguing and back and forth. Why? Because the access point to Torah includes engaging people. Most academics run away from people so that they should not be disturbed, so that they could gain knowledge. Torah tells us that you have to engage with people in order to gain divine knowledge. And so that's why we're told that the ways in which a person learns Torah is dibuk chaverim. You have to cleave to other people. Pilpul hatalmidim. You have to have banter and debate over subjects. That's the Torah way of learning. People sit with each other and they work through a concept by arguing and attacking and questioning and debating every single thing that they learn. In other words, to learn Torah correctly, not the part that's a Yerusha, the part that I can inherit just by virtue of my Jewish genealogy, but the depth of Torah requires other people who I care about enough that we can talk and we can debate and we can argue without losing the friendship. Same theme as the first part of the Mishnah. What is this a gateway to? To love my fellow Jew. Even Torah learning is a gateway to love my fellow Jew. Because Torah learning requires me to sit with that fellow Jew and to share ideas and to have the vulnerability of the fact that maybe you won't agree with my idea, maybe you'll disprove my theory, and I'll still get on with you and we'll still be good friends. And then he says, you cannot satisfy yourself only with love of your fellow Jew. It's really important. And it's a very big part of Judaism, to the extent that it's called the underpinning, klal gadol, the overarching principle of the whole of Judaism, on the one hand. And on the other hand, it's a little dangerous because people can sometimes excuse themselves by saying, I care about people, so I'm not so religious. But the most important thing, have you ever heard this? Tell me you've heard this before. The most important thing is to be a mensch. The most important thing is how you care about the next person. So Rabbi Yossi wants us to know that doesn't work, actually. It's a nice theory, but unfortunately the reality is that if we don't have some kind of connection to Hashem and guidance on what it means to be a mensch, so we'll convince ourselves that we're the most menschlich people on the planet, and we'll actually hurt people in the process. So the next thing he says is, as much as you have love of your fellow person, your fellow Jew, you have to have love of Hashem. Kol ma'asecha, every single thing that you do, including all those things that you do to be menschlich, all those things that you do to reach out and to touch somebody else, and to be good to somebody else, and to care for somebody else, it has to be l'shem shamayim. It has to be for love of Hashem, for a higher purpose. That will keep you grounded, it will keep you focused, it will keep you appropriate. Effectively, actually, the two go hand in hand. In fact, it's a three-way connection. It's a three-way connection. This past Shabbos, the 10th of Shvat, was the 70th anniversary of when our Rebbe became the Rebbe of Chabad. And in his inaugural address, one of the things that he said is that the Zohar tells us there are three loves that are interconnected. Love of Hashem, love of the Torah, and love of your fellow Jew. Meaning, you can never have one without the other. If you claim that you love Torah without loving your fellow Jew, you're fooling yourself. If you claim you love your fellow Jew without loving Torah, you're fooling yourself. And if you claim that you love either without loving Hashem, you've missed the point completely. That's what Rabbi Yossi wants us to know. You have to love your fellow Jew, you have to love Torah, and you have to love Hashem. Now, the last phrase that he uses, Kol ma'asecha yu l'shem shamayim, that all of your actions should be directed towards heaven, this is a concept that is brought in many places, and often with a slightly different variation of the theme. Now, we don't have a lot of time to talk about it, so this will be brief, and hopefully we'll just tickle your curiosity enough that you'll look into this more, because it's not the theme of this Mishnah, but we learn it from this Mishnah. So here you've got the expression, Kol ma'asecha yu l'shem shamayim, that all of your actions should be directed towards heaven. And there's a similar expression which is B'chol derachecha da'ehu. It's based on a verse that in all your ways you should know Hashem. Now what's interesting is some of the commentaries use those phrases interchangeably and some dafka don't. So we're going to just take a moment to understand what is the difference between saying all of your actions should be l'shem shamayim, directed towards heaven. How does that differ from saying b'chol derachecha da'ehu, in all your ways you should know him? Basically, it describes that there are two different ways in which a person could live their Judaism. Both of them are absolutely valid. Both of them are levels that we should aspire to. But the one is more advanced than the other. B'chol derachecha da'ehu is more advanced than b'chol ma'asecha yu l'shem shamayim, which is in our Mishnah over here. So let's analyze our Mishnah first. What's Rabbi Yossi saying? Kol ma'asecha. Let's be honest. Let's be honest. You have your things that you do. We all do, right? Everybody enjoys a good plate of food. That's how we are. Ma'asechot, that's part of the human experience. It's something that we do. And in fact, as long as, in our minds, as long as the food is kosher, and as long as we say a bracha before we eat it, there you go. L'shem shamayim. I've taken an activity which is a normal, ordinary human activity, and I've ascribed a spiritual value to it. Kol ma'asecha, all of your activities, l'shem shamayim, serve another purpose, a higher purpose, and that higher purpose is whatever Hashem wants. Here's another example. Another example is a person goes to work in order to earn money. Earning money is universal. It's not unique to the Jewish people. Everybody does it. So it's masecha. It's your activity, the activity of the ordinary person. But when a Jewish person goes to work, le-shem shamayim, they tell themselves, look, if I earn money, then you know what I could do? I could give tzedakah. So right now I'm earning money that does not necessarily have a holy value associated with it. But later on, when I bank the money and I remove a portion of that money and I give it to tzedakah, then it's le-shem shamayim. It proves that my whole working week was for the purpose of being able to serve Hashem. Or alternatively, we all know that the Gemara in Shabbos talks a lot about how you're supposed to spend a lot of money on Shabbos. The Gemara reassures us that the budget that you use for Shabbos will not be taken out of your annual allocation on Rosh Hashanah. So you dafka. Okay, so the person says, I'm going to earn a lot of money. That way I can have a fancy Shabbos. Le-shem shamayim. I'm here for the sake of serving heaven. That basically means that my perspective, if that's how I live, as Rabbi Yossi is telling us over here in this Mishnah, if that's how I live, then effectively I live with this reality. And it's probably a reality that is accessible to all of us. The reality I live with is there's a world. That's true. That's real. In other words, load shedding is real. Potholes are real. Politics is real. The virus is real. And there's also Hashem, who almost, so to speak, from a distance, directs all of that. When I say from a distance, I don't, God forbid, mean that Hashem is disassociated from the world, but Hashem monitors and runs the world as if there is a world that He controls. You know, like, for example, you might control the car that you drive, or you might control the computer that you use. It's not you, but it can't do anything unless you program it to do. So, ma'asecha, my activities are part and parcel of the world that Hashem created, and my actions have to be directed towards Hashem, so to speak, to a higher level that is not part and parcel of this world. I've got to kind of constantly push my reality upwards towards Hashem. Now, if that's my reality, then effectively what I'm saying is that Hashem and the world are two distinct entities where Hashem has control over the world, and that's probably my own experience as well. There's me and my neshama, and my neshama has the power to overtake my world and has the power to guide my world. So there's me and my world, and then occasionally my neshama actually gets the upper hand and controls my world. And that's a great level to achieve. If we could live this way, that every single activity that we do has direction towards Hashem, we'd be doing great. And that's enough for Rabbi Yossi in our Mishnah. But because he brings it up, it's worthwhile for us to take a moment and understand that there's a level beyond that too. And that is be-chol derochecha da'ehu. You see, in the first one, it's le, to. So when you're going to something, it means you're not there yet. And in the second statement, it's be, you're within the experience immediately, which means I don't just eat food, say a bracha over it, and then afterwards use the energy of that food to be able to daven or to learn. But the activity of eating food is a means of serving Hashem. In other words, right now, in the now, this is a holy experience. And that might sound a little bit far-fetched, so let's use the business example, because it's easier. Instead of me saying that the purpose of my business is to earn money so that when I have that money, I could use it for a higher purpose, B'chol derochecha da'ehu means that every moment that I am in my business, I am serving Hashem. So that means that every person I interact with, whether it be a client or a supplier, or whoever it is, whether they be Jewish or not, every interaction is used as an opportunity to connect with Hashem. So if it's a Jewish person, we do a mitzvah together when we engage in business. And if it's a non-Jewish person, we talk about the concept of a universal code of morals called the Noachide laws, which were given by Hashem for every single human on this planet. And every action action that I take within my business is taken with a consciousness of how can this right now help me serve Hashem, not later. That's an awareness where a person recognizes that the world is not distinct from Hashem but controlled by Hashem, but rather to understand that the world is one with Hashem. It's a much deeper experience, and it takes a tremendous amount of learning and focus and davening and personal growth to reach that point. Because when you reach that point, your neshama is not just a component of who you are that happens on occasion to take control. Your neshama becomes who you are. And so while Rabbi Yossi over here introduces us to the first level of aspiration, which will take us a tremendous amount of effort to achieve, it's worthwhile for us to know that there's an even higher level of aspiration beyond that too. And as I said, hopefully this will just tickle your curiosity so that you'll want to know a little bit more about what exactly these two levels mean and where exactly do I find the path to achieve them. So for today, we'll leave with a simple message: love of your fellow Jew, love of the Torah, and love of Hashem. Those are the three intertwined realities that make sure that I'm as Jewish as a Jewish person is supposed to be. Please God, we should succeed in achieving it.